I said last week that the New Orleans Saints were nearing rock bottom. Why? Because this is rock bottom. We got all of that and a little bit of lanyap for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, the New Orleans Saints must embrace who they are, why they should be looking for their future in the 2025 NFL draft, although that will only be the beginning for them. We're going to dive into the fact that the Saints should consider selling at the trade deadline, and we're going to kick it all off with the fact that the New Orleans Saints should be at this point embracing their reset. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. New customers can place $5 and you're going to be able to get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just head over to FanDuel.com to get started. Last week, I made the comment that the New Orleans Saints were nearing rock bottom, that it was almost rock bottom after their loss last week. And a lot of people said, well, Ross, no, that's not them nearing rock bottom. They're at rock bottom. Wrong. This is rock bottom for the New Orleans Saints. And that's exactly why I said that last week, because I said that rock bottom would be losing to the worst team in the NFL, the Carolina Panthers, and the New Orleans Saints found a way to do that today. And what that means to me with this team now having its first 7-game losing streak since the 1999 season, the Mike Ditka-led 3-13 New Orleans Saints during that time, is that the Saints need to embrace who they are. And who they are right now is a team that is in major need of a reset. And it's not going to be as simple as flipping one switch, pressing one button, a quick reset. It's going to take some time for this New Orleans Saints team to really reset, rebuild, and retool itself. I will take the sentiment from my good friend John Hendricks from over at Second and Saints. Doesn't matter what you call it, the Saints simply must do it. That means head coach. That means the roster. That means taking a look at your front office. Are you making the right decisions, and do you have the right people making those decisions? All of that has to be examined. This is rock bottom for the New Orleans Saints. And let's be very, very real. And I'm sorry, I know that there was a game today that the Saints lost 22-23, but that's not really what the real point this day, this evening really is it? It's about what happens after that 22-23 loss. We'll dive into a little bit of the game as we kind of go through. We'll talk about it, or we'll hit sort of elements of the game. But I think that this point is really the biggest thing that's on everybody Saints fans' mind. And the question is, what are the New Orleans Saints going to do to get better moving forward? And I don't mean moving forward here throughout 2024. Make no mistake about it. The New Orleans Saints season is realistically over. They're not technically mathematically eliminated, but they came into this game with a 4% playoff chance. Then they lost, and now they sit at 2-7 in line for the number 2 overall selection and are currently considered, based on conference record, division record, things like that, the worst team in the NFL. So what is the team going to do starting tomorrow, starting over the course of the next day, whatever it might be, to get better for its future? That's the question that the New Orleans Saints have to ask. And when they answer the question, they have to be sure that the right people are answering that question. Gail Benson, the owner, is going to come under fire in terms of all this, in terms of like how she's driving the ship, how she's steering, her involvement, all these other things. She's very involved. I can tell you that. She's an incredibly supportive owner, but is she too supportive to a fault? We're going to find out over the course of the rest of the season going into the offseason. Is general manager Mickey Loomis the right person to be making personnel decisions, roster decisions, direction of the franchise decisions? And is Dennis Allen the right person to make the decisions, or is Dennis Allen the right person to drive the force of living out those decisions? right? And living out who this team should be, right? Your identity in the NFL is based on your ability to win football games, first of all, but also your leadership, right? Your leadership establishes your identity. It starts at the top and then it works its way down. And we heard all of this stuff over the course of the offseason about how everyone was saying the same things and how there's really one voice and that all of it starts with people like Mickey, NDA, and others, and then kind of circulates down. Dennis Allen brought in his defensive coaching staff last year, his own offensive coaching staff this year. There was all this kumbaya about the symbiotic relationship between them all. And now you've got a 7-game losing streak for the first time since 1999, following up a gold standard that was built over the course of 2006, 2021. So please understand that when I'm being critical of this team, I'm not being critical of them based on how good I think they should be. I'm not being critical on them based on how good you think they should be. I'm not being critical about them in response to or by comparing them to other NFL teams. I'm being critical about where the New Orleans Saints are right now because of their inability to match the standard that they themselves set. That's the reality of where the New Orleans Saints are at this moment. And so they have got to be looking at all the decisions that need to be made, who is making those decisions, what the solutions are as they move forward, because this New Orleans Saints team now needs to be building towards and putting an eye towards its next iteration, its next era is way more important than what their record is by the end of this season. Now, make no mistake about it. Every single player on this roster for the rest of the season, for the remaining 9 games, is going to go out there and they're going to play their hearts out and they're going to do what they can to win because that's how they set themselves up individually for their best future. Okay, make no mistake about it. That is going to be the case. That's when it comes down to the players. But the Saints and the organization themselves need to be looking at what's going to be best for them moving forward. So they have to consider changes at head coach. That could happen in season. Now that you've lost this 7th straight game and you lost to the 1-7 Carolina Panthers, that could accelerate the timeline. The Saints could turn to Darren Rizzi as their interim head coach, for instance. Joe Woods is their de facto defensive coordinator and then defensive play caller. They can go that route. I don't think that they will, but they can, and they would more than certainly be warranted in doing so. I think anyone would agree with that. Dennis Allen, anybody would agree that if the Saints made that decision, it would be entirely understandable based upon where they are right now. And that wouldn't be an emotional response. That's just simply a realistic response, right? Like we know where this New Orleans Saints season is now. So they could go about that. I think that they still wait to the offseason to do that. That just seems to be the MO of this team. Call it guts, call it whatever it is that you want to call it. That seems to be the way that the New Orleans Saints operate. We'll see if that is the way that they want to operate. We'll know a lot because it's either going to be the offseason or Monday. Like those are your options at this point. So we'll see which way the New Orleans Saints go. Again, I think they have every valid reason to make the decision to move on from Dennis Allen at this point. Because remember, a lot of people sometimes point to the idea that fans are overreacting to this season. But remember that there was also a 2023 and a 2022 that also came in below that same standard that we just discussed that they set for themselves. There's no turnaround coming. And so everything has to be about what happens next in terms of the future for this New Orleans Saints team. So that's where I want to move next coming in. There were a couple of things that were good about this game. I thought Foster Moreau, his touchdown catch was outstanding. Shamar Jean-Charles put together one of the best interceptions I've ever seen. Alvin Kamara had 215 total yards in this game and is inches away from becoming the all-time New Orleans Saints rushing leader. We can't enjoy any of that, however, because the Saints became the first team in the last 20 years to lose a game in which the team outgained the other team by over 150 points and won the turnover battle. Teams are now 275-1. The New Orleans Saints are the and one in that equation. And then a 4th and 4 play call that took everyone by surprise. One read over the middle and then a deep shot down the left on a panic situation makes it so that we don't get to talk about the good things that happen for the New Orleans Saints. Instead, we have to talk about the things that the New Orleans Saints need to do moving forward to create more good things as they go ahead. So that's what I want to dive into next. It all starts with the head coach and the decision that should happen either on Monday or the end of the offseason or the end of the season. Don't get me wrong. However, I also believe that the New Orleans Saints, their retool their reset also begins with the 2024 NFL trade deadline, because I think the New Orleans Saints should become sellers, and they should do so quickly. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends at Robinhood Gold. With Robinhood Gold, you don't need a silver spoon in order to be able to eat up all the financial favors of the top 1%. Robinhood Gold allows others to get the rates and perks that are usually reserved for high society. Now, the resourceful individual with Robinhood Gold can earn a very liberal rate of 4.5% APY on uninvested cash and be rewarded with a handsome 3% retirement boost on an IRA account. Robinhood Gold provides the privileges of a high net worth for any net worth. These generous benefits are now available for only $5 a month. The new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. Sign up at Robinhood.com/gold. Terms apply. For product specific disclosures, visit Robinhood.com/gold. Investing involves risk. Rate may change, and gold membership is offered by Robinhood Gold LLC. Today's episode also brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks, the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports. It's super simple. It's not you versus a bunch of mystery lineups that you don't see that you're going up against. Instead, it's you, your knowledge of your favorite sport, favorite player, favorite team versus the house. It's super simple. Prize Picks gives you a projection based on a player. Depending on which sport you choose, you might go football, you might go pro, you might say, Jamar Chase, Cincinnati Bengals wide receiver, 79.5 receiving yards. For instance, you pick more or less than that. You do that for 2 to 6 players, and that's it. That's all you got to do. If you get up to 4 right, you can get up to 100 times your entry back. I love Prize Picks because it's super easy to play, and a lot of times super easy to win as well. So go check them out today. Download the app and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL so you can get $50 instantly after you play your first $5. That's $50 instantly with the promo code LOCKEDONNFL when you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. All right, family, the New Orleans Saints should become sellers if the right deals present themselves before Tuesday's trade deadline. The NFL trade deadline is set for Tuesday, November 5th, coming up this week, at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So 3 p.m. Central time for anybody in the Gulf region. So I think the New Orleans Saints should at least consider becoming sellers when it comes to a few of their veteran players. I think it's important that this team focuses on getting younger, getting more talented, and also making moves that are going to benefit them from a kind of a twofold look, right? What are the moves that you can make that will benefit you from a salary cap standpoint? And what are the moves that you can make that might help you benefit from the draft capital standpoint? And then you can use that draft capital either to draft young players or potentially to move for other young, but already sort of like, let's call them young veteran players, like guys on their coming to the end of their second or first deal or at the beginning of their second deal that might be movable or tradable, attainable, things like that. I think that those are the things that you have to get into. And there's a good point here from Sean who says last minute sellers always get robbed. So it's really, really important. And that is oftentimes true. So it is really, really important that the Saints only make the moves that actually help that twofold plan that I just talked about. What are the moves that are going to help you build your draft capital? And what are the moves that's going to help you kind of navigate your salary cap situation? The New Orleans Saints are currently $62 million over the salary cap. And there's one move that they could make that would return them some, I'll call it decent trade value or draft capital, but also would free up a ton of salary cap space for next season. And it's the rumored move that you've probably already heard about, which is Marshon Lattimore. Now, there's been no rumors that the Saints are shopping Marshon Lattimore. I want to be really clear about this. The rumors are that teams are reaching out about Marshon Lattimore, right? So that's not the same thing. It's not the same as selling and calling up teams and saying, hey, we're running a fire sale. What you want for what you're willing to give for number 23 over here. It's not that. It's other teams like the Kansas City Chiefs, for instance, who might feel like, hey, we need some help at corner. They lost L'Jarius Sneed over the course of the offseason. They have that Spagnuolo defense that's really good. They might say, you know what, he's a piece that could really, really help over in Kansas City. We want to go and get him. And then they pick up the phone and they call Mickey Loomis and the New Orleans Saints. And I think Mickey Loomis and the New Orleans Saints should be listening. Listen, sentimentality always plays into all of these situations, right? It becomes very hard to part with players that have become beloved. Marshon Lattimore in 2017 shows up. He's a defensive rookie of the year, partnered with Alvin Kamara, who is the offensive rookie of the year, has been a lockdown, lights out cornerback for the New Orleans Saints, but also is approaching 30 years old and counts over $30 million against their salary cap next year. And if the Saints were to trade him, they could save $16 to $18 million against next year's salary cap if they traded him right now. And they could probably get a day 2 pick, either a round 2 or a round 3 pick. Maybe it's some type of day 3 pick that conveys and, is a conditional pick that turns into a second round pick when he meets a certain level of playing time or something like that. Like there's ways to sort of figure all that out, because obviously availability is a big concern for Marshon Lattimore, who missed a large portion of 2 seasons ago with a lacerated kidney, not his fault. He missed a large part of last season with another injury, getting rolled up on. And then now he has missed a couple of games already so far this season with a hamstring injury that he has a history with. So those are going to be things that are going to kind of impact what a trade looks like. But he's also an incredibly talented player. And if you put him in a situation where maybe he feels like they're closer to a championship, he's closer to a ring, stuff like that, then maybe all of a sudden things kind of look a little bit different in terms of what he's able to provide. So if you're the New Orleans Saints and a team calls you and says, we'll give you a second round pick or a third round pick that turns into a second round pick with a certain number of playing time, with a certain number of whatever, kind of thresholds need to be hit to kind of create conditions for that, whatever it might be, I think it's worth considering and entertaining that move, and maybe pitting a couple of players up against one another to see, or a couple teams up against one another to see if maybe they can try to outbid one another. Maybe a team like Baltimore, whose defense is a little shaky, could use a guy like him opposite Marlon Humphrey, for instance. Whatever it might be, there are teams out there that could really utilize a guy like Marshon Lattimore, who, by the way, in terms of trading for Marshon Lattimore, you don't have to take on much. He had a base salary of $1.21 million that's prorated through 9 weeks already played. And so you're only paying what remains on that $1.21 million contract, which means 2 things. It means A, the Saints don't have to eat any additional salary, and B, the team that's trading for, there's more teams that can get involved in the bidding war to potentially trade for him. The New York Jets could be another one of those teams as well, pair him and Sauce Gardner, for instance, something like that. So there's teams that make sense, that have the money, that have the cap space, because you don't need a lot of cap space. They can go out there and going to do it. Detroit, as Steel Bill mentions here, is a great option too. Somebody that he's familiar with, Aaron Glenn, all that. Like there's really good options to potentially see if you can get teams to maybe bicker with one another, bargain, and maybe run up the price a little bit to see if you can get a good return back, so that when you do become that last second seller, that you don't end up in a situation where you don't get a return on a player that makes sense. Another player that could be moved is defensive end Chase Young. There's been a lot of rumors around teams potentially checking in on him. He would be one that I would keep an eye out on as well. The Saints, it's a very incentive heavy deal. And so the Saints would only be really owing money based upon how those incentives are hit. But if he goes to the other team and he still hits those incentives, then obviously there's a contractual issue there. But that could be another option that the Saints could go with to potentially return what I would say would probably be a day 3 pick when it comes to Chase Young, but maybe a third round. I don't know, but probably more likely a day 3 pick in that situation. But maybe you can get something in the early day 3 situation, like a 4th round pick or something like that. Then there's other smaller moves you could potentially make for additional day 3 selections. Willie Gay Jr., Isaiah Foskey, and others that can maybe bring you in, a late day 3, round 5, round 6, round 7 type of selection that might feel useless. That might feel like that doesn't go a long way for you, but as much as the New Orleans Saints need right now, get as many draft picks as you can so that you can either make the decision to mobilize with those draft picks to go and get the prospect that you want, or utilize those draft picks and sort of do a little bit of a spaghetti at the wall approach, right? Have a big draft class and then hopefully somebody hits for you. So I think that all of those players could be in the conversation of players to potentially get moved if you're the New Orleans Saints. And again, I think they should be sellers. I think they should at least be entertaining this and at least considering the phone calls that they do get for some of these players. They're not saving their season. So the next thing you have to do is save their future. And the best way to save your future is to give yourself building blocks. The guys that we've mentioned on this list, they're not building blocks for the New Orleans Saints, but they can get new building blocks in trades for those players. And at this point, you're in a situation where you either got to swing or you're going to watch. You're gonna take the strike, right? So you might as well take a swing here and see what you're able to get in return. Coming up next, as we mentioned, in terms of taking a swing, nothing is guaranteed in the NFL draft. The New Orleans Saints, but the New Orleans Saints are moving on up, at least when it comes to the draft board. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by Hillsdale College. Hillsdale College is giving you access to free classes for over 40 different free online courses. Those courses can include anything from literature like Shakespeare, studies on The Tempest and Hamlet. You can also dive into things like the laws of chemistry, mathematics and logic. There's a ton for you to check out. So if you're somebody that maybe has been away from the education game for a little while, want to learn some new stuff, here's a free way to do it, and it's through Hillsdale College. All of Hillsdale's courses are self-paced, so you can take them at your own leisure, and whenever you want to. You can tune in whenever you want to. Plus, you can get deeper readings, quizzes, discussions, and enjoy the lectures as well. So go right now to hillsdale.edu/locked on to enroll. There's no cost and it's easy to get started. That's hillsdale.edu/locked on to register. Hillsdale.edu/locked on. Today's episode brought to you by friends over at FanDuel, where you can get ready to tackle the NFL season with America's #1 sportsbook over at FanDuel.com. Because right now, new customers can put down $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. FanDuel Sportsbook gives you everything that you need to be able to place your bets all in the same place, place all your bets on the NFL, and it's all on one app where you can also check out live stats. You can get some play-by-play all in the same place where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Right now, the New Orleans Saints 3-point underdogs at home as the Atlanta Falcons are set to come to town next week. Maybe you think the New Orleans Saints can get back on the win column. Maybe you're not so sure. You think this win streak extends to 8. Well, you can get in on all of that over at FanDuel.com today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with America's #1 sportsbook and an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints are moving on up the draft board. That is, the New Orleans Saints right now hold the #2 overall selection, or in line to hold the #2 overall selection after the results of this game. Only the New England Patriots end up who lost to the Tennessee Titans in overtime this week, hold or are below or above them, if you will, sitting at the #1 overall selection at this point. I want to dive into a little bit of my thoughts in the NFL draft and where things kind of stand for them and why the draft won't solve everything, right? It's just the beginning of building a new foundation for what should be a new era of New Orleans Saints football. Before I do that, I do want to give you an update on Chris Olave. Chris Olave, of course, took a very scary hit in this game. Xavier Woods, who unfortunately has a couple of these hits in his career or in his history, going high and hitting Chris Olave as the pass went over the middle of the field. People are going to talk about hospital ball from Derek Carr, stuff like that. I've never really been one for the hospital ball thing. We saw Tom Brady throw players into traffic. We saw Drew Brees throw players into traffic and injuries and things like that. We don't talk about them. The difference is that those guys won games. Derek Carr, not so much so far here in New Orleans, as the New Orleans Saints have not been winning games. And so I'm not going to dive into I'm not going to go into that because that just feels unnecessary. The thing that's most important to me is Chris Olave and his health. So I want to give you an update on his health. we watched this all unfold, and it was mortifying seeing Chris Olave just kind of crumble to the ground, unconscious for what felt like several minutes. He certainly was being tended to for several minutes. I'm not exactly sure when it is that he regained consciousness. Obviously, by then, teammates, opponents, coaches, medical staff, refs, everyone was surrounding him, being there for him, supporting him and everything. It was a nice display. But I think that the thing that you have to look at here is at what point is enough, and does he need more time off of the field? I'm not talking about him ending his career. That's his decision to make. But I'm just wondering, like, he had the concussion a couple weeks ago. He was checked for a concussion last week. Should he have been on the field this week? Like, it just feels like it's a compounding issue the more and more that these concussions happen. You remember, some Saints fans will remember Damian Swann from years ago and how those the compounding of those concussions and things like that. So I'm not going to go into what Chris Olave should do with his future. That's his decision. He's a grown man. He'll figure that out. But what I will say is that he was taken to the hospital, loaded up on a backboard, carted off, taken to Atrium Health. Carolina's here in North Carolina and in Charlotte, was seen there, evaluated, and then was released. His brother updating on social media that he was up and walking. He was able to call Josh, his brother, and speak with him, and then eventually was transported back to the to Bank of America Stadium. It was actually at Bank of America Stadium while we were speaking to Dennis Allen, Derek Carr, folks like that, and their post-game pressers. So he did make it back to the stadium after the game and is going to travel with the team back to New Orleans. I would be shocked if he's on the field up against the Atlanta Falcons. Like, if I'm the Saints medical staff, especially knowing that there's no like turning this season around at this point, there's just no need to risk further head injury, things like that, with a second concussion on the season. It was now his fourth concussion of his NFL career, 2 concussions before that when he was in college, and then he was checked for a concussion last week, which wasn't called a concussion. And so I think that those are that's the update, though, is that he's okay. He was up, he's walking, he's talking, all that other stuff. He had movement on all 4 extremities when he was being transferred to the hospital. So all good news in terms of his individual health. All the other ancillary stuff, I'm going to tell you right now, I couldn't care less. Like, that's not important right now. Chris Olave is okay. That's the update that I want to tell you. We'll dive into the other crap later. So what I want to dive into next is the NFL draft for the New Orleans Saints, right? We're talking about the Saints right now being in line for the number 2 overall selection in this year's draft and everything like that, and how that could put them in position to begin to rebuild or reset their foundation for their future, which has to be different than their present. Like, the New Orleans Saints need changes. They need changes at head coach. They need changes on the roster. They might need changes in the front office. Like, this is a Saints team that is just in that era of existence at that point. That's what happens when you have a 7-game losing streak, right? Like, again, we're not being unfair, right? I would never be unfair when it comes to these conversations. This is a fair conversation to have at this point, right? Because any team would be having this conversation at this point. So if the Saints end up moving into this 2025 NFL draft with let's just call it a top 5 draft selection. Look, there's no surefire quarterbacks in this class. I know everybody's excited about Shedeur Sanders in Colorado. I personally am excited about Shedeur Sanders as well, but I would need to know who's the offensive coordinator, who's the head coach. Do you have what's necessary to be able to develop a top flight first round quarterback at that point? So it makes sense if the Saints make a change at head coach and they make the decision to bring in somebody that is a known quarterback developer, whether that's to work with Spencer Rattler or Jake Haener, or to potentially work with what would be a third option. And I've said from the very, very beginning, that it's unlikely that Spencer Rattler and Jake Haener will be the only quarterbacks to be in the conversation to be the successors to Derek Carr. Very unlikely that there wouldn't be a third option. That third option could come here in 2025, or it could come in 2026. The next thing that the Saints could do is build the Ferrari around the driver, right? They could utilize their draft selections in 2025 to be able to help to build what it is that they're preparing for, whoever their next quarterback is going to be, whether that's a quarterback that they draft in 2026, somebody they bring in through free agency in 2026, Spencer Rattler or Jake Haener ends up developing by then, whatever it might be. I think at this point, that, or you make a move for, some other quarterback somewhere, right, in a trade, right? Malik Willis has had this fantastic kind of rebirth over in Green Bay. Is there something there? What's going to happen with Anthony Richardson over at the Indianapolis Colts? Is he a project that you're willing to take on? I think those are projects that are worth it as long as you make a change at head coach. I don't think you can trust right now this coaching staff as it's built to develop young quarterback talent at head coach, right? I think you've got great stuff with Andrew Janocko when it comes to your quarterback coach. I think you're seeing the struggling play caller of Clint Kubiak so far this season. I think that's fair to say. And so I think guys like Cam Ward, guys like Shedeur Sanders, guys like all this, whoever, is in need of kind of that developmental process, you can go after that player. You just have to have the right people driving the ship, steering the ship in order to make sure you're maximizing the development of that young player. So what I would say is that 2025 is not going to be saved by who you draft, right? 2025 is going to be a big sort of retool, rebuild, reset year. That's the way that I look at it. 2026 is really the thing that you're kind of shooting for. More drafts in between, more potential to build up more draft capital, and a much better salary cap situation by the time that you get into those conversations as well. So those are the things that I would be looking at as a New Orleans Saints fan in terms of starting to lay the foundation for the next era, next iteration, next version, however it is that you want to look at it, of the New Orleans Saints. It starts this offseason. It could start in less than 24 hours. It could start at the trade deadline this year, but really everything gets really rolling in terms of building your foundation as opposed to building your potential to go out there and get a foundation. You can't start building your foundation until free agency in March, right? Your offseason. So that's where it all begins, is this offseason. The New Orleans Saints need to begin to lay the foundation for their next era during that time. 2025 draft class, of course, is a part of that, but the Saints will have to make a decision to make. Do you roll the dice on what is an okay quarterback class in the first round, or do you invest maybe some mid-round picks somewhere that ends up trying to see if you can land somebody that can develop, or do you build the Ferrari around the driver and pull in as many weapons and playmakers and game changers as you can so that you're ready for whoever that next quarterback ends up being? I think that's a question that the New Orleans Saints will have to answer up next. And if they do answer that question, they'll have to answer it with a real understanding of who the next leader is in their building before anything else. They can't make that decision right now. All right. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, we'll dive in a little bit more into the game, but we're still going to be looking at the lasting impact of this game, because the game is not the loss to Carolina, is not about the loss to Carolina. It's about everything that follows it. So we're going to dive into a little bit more of that, including the players that the New Orleans Saints should be sure to keep around, including cornerback Alontae Taylor. We'll dive into that and much more in tomorrow's episode. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out Locked On NFL. I'm sure Tyler Rowland, the Madman, is going to have some not so nice things to say about the New Orleans Saints after that one. But go and check them out over at Locked On NFL. We appreciate you very, very much for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And a big shout out to Doc, to Nick, and to Kevin as well. And of course, if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing, how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.